Well, Brooklands opened in 1907, as we both know, largely because Hugh Locke King realised we could not race on the roads here in Britain, and we were falling behind in the automotive industry. Everywhere else on the planet, they rattled around in cars and they got ahead of the game. What happened with France, which was then the preeminent motoring country, was Le Matin decided to come up with a publicity-generating long-distance road race to prove how great French automobiles were. And as we opened in 1907 to go round a circuit, they decided in 1907 that they would have a race from Peking to Paris. And that is the subject of your book today, Kassia, and welcome to
Thank you very much for having
Brooklands.
me. Thank you.
And it's also entitled A Race to the Future, because there's an awful lot around this particular race that we want to talk about, rather than just ruin the story of the race for everybody who's yet...
Spoiler alert.
The spoiler alert, who's yet to read it. Now, we may accidentally give the winner away during this, but we'll try not to give too much of the action away. So, really, what inspired you to write a book about a race from 1907? Because most of the people who write motoring books, let's be honest, are sort of, baptised in Castrol and grow up with bits of pre-war car in their bedroom.
Again, spoiler alert, that's not the case for me. I don't come from a mechanically minded family at all. My dad's definitely a kind of like buy a very solid car and just keep it until it absolutely falls apart. And I still don't know one end of the spanner from another, and if I break down or get a flat tire, I'm absolutely useless. So, not an obvious topic for me to pick, you would think. However, for me, there are a few things. My previous books are The Secret Lives of Colour and the Golden Thread, and they are histories of colour and textiles, respectively. And you might think this is a really odd next step to choose, but for me, there is something that all three have in common, and that's that all three are things that are everyday routine, you see around you, and yet they're so familiar you tend to overlook them. And I think that's true for colour, I think that's true for textiles, and I think that's true for the car. And yet I think all three really benefit from a kind of revisit, and you can find so much in their history that illuminates the world around you and can kind of shift the perspective of the everyday. The other thing that I think, a lot of people who write car books are, as you say, absolutely steeped in that tradition, and it comes from a love that they've had since childhood of this topic. But I also think there's an awful lot of people who, like me, are not car mad, and yet we live in the world that the car helped create. And so for people, for generalists, I think it's also a real shame that if the history of the car isn't more widely known by the average person, because it's fascinating. It tells us a lot about the world that we live in. And like I said, it's relevant to all of us, whether we are fascinated by it or not. Yeah.
Your perspective, what interested me, and people haven't read the book obviously yet, but just to give you an idea, is that you intersperse the story of the race, and I have to say it's very well written. It's almost novelish in the way the story is portrayed of the race. So it's highly entertaining. But within that, you put little chapters about social history, politics, technology, and they're all, rather well written précis of things that I think other people would never even think of doing. I think if you just want to know a little bit about the history of the time in certain places in China, say, then read the book, because in the space of 5 pages you can get it. Was that the approach of the historian in you, rather than someone interested in automobiles, which obviously wasn't your first love?
Absolutely. So I knew when I first had the idea and when I first sort of discovered the story of the race that I just thought it was a fantastic way in to a moment in history when it felt like the world was about to have a sort of a little twist almost, or a little judder towards the future. I think I think about it like history as being a little bit like tectonic plates. They're kind of moving against each other, and sometimes you get a kind of sticking point where things seem to hang on for a decade or two, and then you get a judder forward. And I feel like this is one of those moments, you know, the 1900s, that kind of, you know, 1895 to 1905, 1910, you get this kind of sticking point just before you have this judder forward. And I felt this was this race was a fantastic way in to tell so many of those fascinating stories. I think if you look at what was going on in China at the time, it can tell you a lot about, you know, the way that China feels about its own history now. The same with Russia. We tend to think about, you know, the Russian Revolution of 1905 and then the Russian Revolution of 1917. But actually 1907, you know, there's still so much going on in Russia, and it gives you a bit of a different perspective on those revolutions and what's about to happen. Also, you know, as a nation, we're very interested in the First World War, but actually this time you're seeing the groundwork being laid for that conflict. And again, it helped. I felt that looking at 1907 really helps you understand what will happen in that conflict in a slightly different way. Yeah,
because you took the politics of the situation, but running contemporaneously alongside it was technological innovation. We say we have 2 generations of the digital age and 7 of the industrial age and sort of 250 or so of the agricultural age, and the rest of it was, you know, just us sort of gradually evolving a little bit. But you had this massive leap forwards. American Civil War, first transport of troops to the front in bulk. We had the invention of the machine gun, the invention of the motor car. 1903, the first flight. By the end of the First World War, we had bombers and fighters. So alongside all these political machinations, suddenly all this new technology is coming into play. And the other thing is the telegraph system, which is, those of you who haven't ever read it, The Victorian Internet by Tom Stanchey, brilliant book, absolutely brilliant book, because what it displays is the power of communications and the speed, and that was really the reason I think Le Matin could offer a race and write about it on the front pages in good time, in real time, effectively.
Yeah, the existence of the telegraph, or you could say that this race is as much about the existence of the telegraph and communications as it is about the car. Of course, you need the car in order to do the race, but in order to cover the race and in order for it to be something that a newspaper would be interested in putting on, you needed to have the telegraph. You know, they embedded journalists with the drivers, and the journalists were able to send back telegraphs, letting the newspapers know what was going on at any given time, and that allowed for, you know, mass dissemination of race reports. You know, where are the drivers now? So you can see newspapers were publishing maps showing the various locations of the different drivers. They were, you know, publishing up-to-date race reports. They were publishing telegrams by individual drivers who'd gotten stuck or left behind, or a piece of kit had gone, you know, haywire. And so you were able to have to create this very rich picture on a day-to-day basis. And also the route itself, which if you look at a map of the ground between Peking and Paris, the route they go is not the most obvious one. The reason they chose it is because it very closely echoed the telegraph wires, and so you know, and so people could send these reports, and also, you know, presumably call for help if and when, as it was widely expected, there would be problems, there would be breakdowns, there would be repairs that they wouldn't be able to do on the ground, and then help and aid and spare parts could be brought to them by the train, and they could, you know, telegraph for help.
I mean, there were a few incidences where it was suspected and admitted to later that maybe a train had been involved at a difficult part of the route for some of the competitors. But on the whole, what this race set out to do was to prove the motor car as a viable means of long-term, long-distance transportation, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was essentially in the article published by Le Matin announcing the idea of this race, which was published on the 31st of January 1907, they basically said what is happening at the moment with car racing is doing the car a disservice. They thought that, you know, races run on circular tracks, on circuits, was hampering the development of the car, And actually a far better test would be to do a kind of real world off-circuit race or journey from Peking to Paris. And they sort of put it as a kind of challenge to the automotive industry. Is anyone prepared to do this? Will anyone, take a car, take it to Peking, and then see if it's possible to get to Paris? And they very much said that we're not too sure if it's possible. And later on, they were saying we don't think it's possible, but we'd like to challenge the car industry to see whether it is possible. And we think that will far better advance the automobile as a technology, as a practical technology, not just a kind of leisure thing. We think this is a far better test of the technology and will help advance it.
The other thing it helped advance was the sale of newspapers.
Absolutely.
Because we had the 1870 Education Act here. Children went to school really for the first time, learnt to read, so you suddenly had subscribers, people who would buy the newspaper. Most of the other European countries were doing the same. Largely out of self-interest rather than altruism, because soldiery suddenly needed to learn how to read and had to be fit enough. So they really got their own people up to speed in terms of health and literacy to make it happen. But that gave a huge audience, didn't it, to these newspapers, then thinking, well, what do I do to get new people on board? And I think the idea of these competitions, whether it was a balloon around the world, whether it was bicycle race, a human race, or cars, it greatly increased the sale of newspapers and really made some of the, as we know, what were called the newspaper barons.
If you think about it, it's a fantastic business idea. You propose a race. This race could take weeks or months. You embed journalists who are going to send daily or sometimes twice daily reports, and so people will become invested. They will, you'll introduce them to the characters at the beginning of the story. You'll set up this potential challenge. Will they make it? Will they not? Is it possible? Is it not? It's about the new technology. Very much bound up in this whole idea. It was a Parisian newspaper, a Western audience. Was the idea that you were sort of bringing technology to the benighted people of China. You were sort of giving them giving them almost like a hand along with your kind of your exposure of new technology. And so you have this sort of stew of ideas, this stew of potential benefits to society, potential benefits to the newspapers, and potential benefits to the readers. They can follow this story along. They can feel good about the spread of civilization and new technology and modernity, and they'll be hooked into this story for days, weeks, months on end. That's great business. When I
was a child, I used to watch films like The Great Race and those magnificent men in their flying machines, and something of this book, I think, is around that. It seems to be invested in that. Those characters were straight out of a sort of Boy's Own magazine, weren't they? It must have given you some great ideas to write about, because you had all these eccentric people, wealthy, good-looking, rich, well-connected. Italian prince who was also frighteningly well organised.
Very well organised, yeah.
You had Goddard, who was the baddie. He was a bit of a Terry Thomas character. Tell us about the appeal of those for you.
Yeah, so I think I came across this story when I was researching one of my earlier books, and I felt a bit like I'd stumbled across a secret, and I was so delighted that I had come across the story. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it was not more widely known than it is, because it is so fantastic. You've got this incredible journey that seemed impossible to the people undertaking it. They freely admitted, we're not too sure if we can do this. And then you've got this incredible cast of characters. You've also got this accusations at the time and in the decades and centuries since of cheating, of skullduggery, of people putting their thumb on the scales in order to help the wealthiest and perhaps most obvious candidate for victory win. You've got the idea. You've got this kind of nationalistic competitiveness and arguments along the way, and characters rubbing up against each other, and characters who are clearly people who are clearly never going to get on. They come from different walks of life. They're very different. Their characters are very different, and suddenly they're thrown into an unfamiliar world in unreliable machines, and off they go, and they're on their own. And that amalgamation of great characters, new technology, unfamiliar landscape, challenging landscape, it just makes for a perfect recipe. And like I said, when I came across the story, I couldn't believe that a book hadn't been written about it recently, and I was absolutely desperate to write it. I pitched the idea very early on, and my editors were a bit like, oh, it's very different from colour and textiles. Are you sure you're the person to write it? And I was like, I'm going to. It's all I want to do. Luckily, I was able to persuade them, and I think they would agree now that they're happy that I persuaded them as well. But yes, I just thought it was fantastic, and I really wanted to be the one to tell the story.
Looking at the characters in there, Prince Borghese, he is just almost a caricature of the Italian aristocrat. You've got Italy as a very young country. Finally, the Risorgimento came together, 1871. He's out really to prove something, that Italy is a force to be reckoned with nationally in more or less anything. And you've got France, which controlled huge parts of Italy for a while. So there's almost a little bit of rivalry there. The French must have been quite upset and think that someone very well organised, very wealthy, with an awful lot of connections, is out to really steal the thunder, because they set this race up to prove how good France was. Do you think there was a point when France was really past its prime automatively?
So I think when they proposed the race, they had no doubt in their mind that it would be a demonstration of French dominance in this area. They were traditionally the sort of centre of the motoring world. They had the best roads, and most of the manufacturers who were really valued worldwide were French, and a lot of similar, much shorter but kind of similar races. Intercity races within Europe had been won by Frenchmen and French vehicles. So they were pretty sure that it would be a sort of a demonstration of French power. By the time that actually the drivers get to the start line, first it's quite a reduced field. It's only five automobiles, and one of the cars is Dutch and one of the cars is Italian. Prince Borghese was very definite, despite the fact that he was very diplomatic and took care to never rub the French up the wrong way as far as he could. He was also very careful to make this a very Italian car. Clearly he was very proud. Not only was it an Italian automobile called the Itala, it had Italian Pirelli tyres. And he, in his letter to Pirelli, was sort of, emphasised that he wanted them to be Italian tyres. So this was something that he cared about. But also, again, it sets up this ground for conflict, because early on you start getting separation between the different vehicles. The Prince Borghese takes a very early and very compelling lead, and suddenly Le Matin is scrambling to try and manage the message of the race and manage their readers' expectations, and to try and sort of claw a victorious French narrative from unfolding situation.
It did towards the end as well, didn't it? Because you had, we have issued the spoiler, but Borghese comes stonking through and wins by some margin. But the newspaper's still selling the benefits of the French cars that were coming afterwards.
Absolutely. Firstly, you get this real, although, I call it a race, and they thought about it as a race at the time. The idea of what it should be was very loose at the beginning. They thought about it as just being a challenge. It was proposed as just being a challenge. Is it even possible? Maybe all the cars should and the people should stay together. Of course, they get on the ground, and immediately it descends into a race. But by the time the Prince starts really pulling ahead, and it's clear that if there is a race, that the French are not winning it, you start getting the organisers putting out editorials saying this is not a race, and then later on, still, when the prince has already arrived in Paris, you get this kind of again, there's sort of a changing of the parameters of what this even is. Isn't it such a great demonstration of the reliability of the de Dion-Boutons, these French vehicles, that two of them have managed to stay together throughout? And isn't that much better demonstration of what a car can do? So you get this kind of massaging of the narrative and changing of the parameters, even if, like I said, it was very much seen as a race by the people on the ground and by the readers of the newspapers. And
I think the cheating that went on, it worked for everybody though, didn't it? Because it perpetrated a race. If only one car had been going, it wouldn't have given much publicity, and the person winning it would have won really nothing. So actually, the people, by cheating, kept the other person preeminent, didn't they?
Yeah, so I think, the idea that it should, a race to be interesting and to be compelling sort of needs to be competitive. It is really, it's not much of a victory if one person just is absolutely, flying ahead on their own. And so you do get these moments throughout the race where actually the distance between the cars really closes in a much more compelling way, and that adds sort of an excitement. And you also get the behaviour of the different actors in the race, sort of, their behaviour kind of leaks out, and you get this kind of these revelations about who they really are and what they've really been doing, and that again helps keep the spirit of the race alive. You also get this moment where Prince Borghese is kind of forced to take this very big detour. He takes this huge detour. He doesn't need to go up to St Petersburg from Moscow. Originally, it had been considered that they would just carry on driving westwards from Moscow, and instead he sort of heads north to St Petersburg at sort of a detour of about 500 miles. And that helps keep things interesting as well, because suddenly some of the cars who've been in the rear of the field really start to speed up, and it looks like if they carry on with their pace, that they might very easily overtake him.
And the Russians keep entertaining Prince Borghese, so he's going to be around for a while. He's not a very sociable man. He's got this reputation in the centuries since as being sort of of wanting to go to St Petersburg to have a banquet in his honour and see a mistress and all this other kind of these rumours that have cropped up. But if you look at his actual behaviour, if you look at his character, and I've spoken to members of his family as well, that couldn't be further from the truth. He was a very serious guy. He just wanted to get back home. He just wanted to reach his destination. But there was this whole programme of events that he was supposed to partake in, and he was really sort of buttonholed by various organisers and made to go to these things. But made to go to parties by mistake. He was a grudging participant in some of the more sociable elements of the race. But he also had this almost Teutonic efficiency about him, didn't he? Whereas some people can be quite cavalier. He knew what he wanted to achieve, and we're talking about an age when there was no infrastructure for motor cars, no petrol stations, no motorways, nothing like that. They had to lodge where they could or sleep by the car, and obviously have their supplies left in terms of petrol. So he almost defied the stereotype in being so organised, whereas the others perhaps weren't quite as organised, or they didn't pick the right partners to assist them.
I think there was a little question of picking the right partners. I also think that they were very wedded to the French drivers were very, very close to the organising committee and Le Matin. They were far closer than the Prince, and so they were very wedded to the plans that had been made in this chaotic planning phase right at the very beginning, whereas the Prince was a lot more happy to trust the knowledge of people on the ground. So, particularly the largest section was the sort of Russian section, and he, would choose the route that was suggested by the Russians. Now, that sounds very sensible to me, and so it proved for him. If you're choosing the route suggested by people on the ground, they can direct you towards the best fuel supplies, but also the best road for an automobile. Whereas the French cleaved to these earlier plans and had a really tough time of it. And that's just a sort of a question of temperament and also of loyalty, I think, in a way, to the original, the route and the idea as set by Le Matin.
Yes, because he did essentially go out of his way. Now, The race really sort of set out to prove one of two theories. That a big, heavy, powerful car would beat a lighter, perhaps slower, more nimble car. And we thought that race might sort it out. But as we were saying off camera earlier, in the Baja 500, you had these huge V8 Ford Broncos and these very, very light VW sand rails. It's one of those ongoing questions, isn't it? Which is better in any given situation?
Yes, I think now it seems sort of very obvious that the most powerful car won. But I think at the time, and if you're looking at the terrain, that assumption, that today's assumption, it proved correct, doesn't seem so obvious because the terrain is so bad. You know, there are no real roads to speak of for the first, week or 2 weeks of the journey. And in fact, although they actually expected there to be roads throughout much of Siberia and Russia, most of the roads had disintegrated because roads were considered an old technology and they'd sort of been overtaken by the railway, and so railway tracks had been laid and the roads had been forgotten about and had fallen into disrepair. So for a long section of the journey, most of the journey, the terrain is dreadful. And in that circumstance, and particularly if there is no road surface, if you're driving on mud, if you're going up mountain passes, if you're having to use rivers instead of roads because there simply is no road left, or there was no road to begin with, then actually a vehicle that you can literally pick up and take over obstacles actually begins to look a lot more sensible. And there were sort of a lot of proponents for that theory at the time, particularly in the sort of very early days of the race. They're having to go up mountain passes that have really only ever been traversed by either the people on foot or by kind of pack animal, donkey, camel. And then they're going to go over sand in the Gobi Desert. And so, maybe in that circumstance, you're thinking actually having a lighter car that can literally be manoeuvred by hand seems a lot more sensible. I think what they didn't take into account was the fact that they were taking a lot of luggage and equipment and supplies with them. They didn't expect their vehicles to be reliable, and so they took an awful lot of spare parts. They also had luggage because they were going to be gone for months, and they had to take food and water and fuel and oil for however many days until they could find their next cache. So they were very heavily laden, and then the power, the sort of the ratio of power and weight starts to shift when you're carrying an awful lot of gear.
The other thing with that is all the cars seem very robust, which is pretty impressive in 1907.
Nearly all.
Yeah, we tend to, we tend to think cars now very rarely break down. Someone turns up on the laptop, plugs in and tells you what's wrong with it. But 40, 50 years ago, things were going wrong with engines all the time. Most of us in our youth spent half our time at university trying to get our cars to work properly. So it's quite a testament to the motoring industry at the time that in 1907, someone could produce a car that could traverse a huge distance. It really did sort of prove the point, didn't it?
But not only that these cars would have to ford rivers, so they'd be like yoked up to, a team of oxen would be yoked up to, and would haul the car through a river, and the water would be, coming up over the wheels, over the baseboards. Basically they take the vital bits of the engine out, wrap them in oiled rags, carry them over their heads, or at their sides if they were on horseback, and then the car would be dragged through pretty much underwater, come out the other side, it would be reassembled, and then off they'd go. And this happened multiple times, particularly in Mongolia, where there were no roads or bridges, and there were just sort of fording points. They had to go through multiple waterways. And if you think of a modern car trying to do something similar, it wouldn't last very long.
No, it would come to a halt and
grinding halt.
There'd be some very expensive electronics.
Yes.
In many ways, this race almost reminds the sort of the Clarkson Hammond May Grand Tour, because it's all these things being hauled long distances in inhospitable environments, isn't it?
In a way, because the cars do have to be helped out so much by animal power, and it simply wouldn't have been possible without animal power. You think, was this actually a real testament to the car, or was this actually a testament to animal power, or the last days of animal power? Because they simply couldn't have done it without it. The fuel supplies had to be taken out by camel and donkey, and so it simply wouldn't have been possible without pack animals. And yet, what the car managed to achieve, and the narrative that was taken from this race, really helped propel the car to a new level of consciousness, and people felt very differently about the car. I'd say the public perception of the car was affected by this race. Hundreds, tens of thousands of people come and see the winners enter the city. You have all these race reports being consumed worldwide, everywhere from Honolulu to Sydney to Ohio. Everywhere people are reading about these cars traversing very inhospitable terrain, and suddenly you get people thinking, when they'd first heard about the race, they were very skeptical, and they compared it, one newspaper compared it to trying to go from Berlin to Rangoon by motorboat, or flying to the moon by telegraph wire. It's really seen as something that's a bit ridiculous, and then suddenly it's no longer ridiculous, they are actually doing it, and that changes the way people feel about the car.
And probably all the other newspapers trying to get in on the act with something copying it along later on.
Absolutely, they're admitting their mistake. They say, well, this is what we said at the beginning. Clearly, we've been proved wrong. The cars are now reaching Berlin. The cars are now reaching Moscow. They've done it. And I think that realization that that these things are no longer to be taken as a little bit of a joke is a real shift you can see happening in real time as the race develops.
And looking at the characters in it, what fascinated me, and when I was a kid I used to watch something called the FBI story, and at the end they tell you exactly what happened to everybody in that episode, who went to jail, who got promoted, all the rest of it. And it felt like you had a proper ending, you knew what happened. And that's what happens in this book, because I think these people get to the end of an adventure, and normally that's the last we ever know of them. We don't know what happened for the rest of their life. They might have gone and worked for the gas board or something like that. But you have put a proper ending, in the sense that you told us what the characters did post-race, which I find fascinating. Can you enlighten us on that? Or?
So with this story, with the books that have been written about it previously, there was a sort of a rash of interest, particularly in the UK in the late 50s and 60s, and you get a couple of books written about them. And you have this sort of amazing build-up of characters, and I don't necessarily agree with some of the characterization in those books. I think the story is a little bit more complicated, but I really felt I didn't want to leave them at the finish line, because I felt like I was doing them a disservice. I was researching this book for 4 or 5 years, and between first having the idea and publication, it's sort of 6 or 7 years really. So I was very attached to them, and I wanted to find out what had happened to them, and I wanted to give that opportunity to the readers. And I also felt that because the book isn't just about the race is a springboard to talk about technology and politics and the car in general. I felt like also the stories, what happens to the individuals afterwards, helps illuminate some of the other themes that the book picks up. I wanted to sort of shed a light. I also found it really fascinating that so many of them went on to participate in other races, or at least showed interest in other races and carried on being part of the kind of the cars story. So I really wanted that aspect too.
And talking of these characters, we get to the point where it's almost the night before the end of the race. Now, as we were talking off camera about doing, long distance road trips, there is that horrible moment of anticlimax. You built yourself up to 3 or 4 weeks of, driving across a continent to arrive at a certain space and, have your ice cold in Alex moment. And actually, the night before, there's this horrible feeling it's all coming to an end, and reality comes. And I remember watching Richard Noble's crew from Thrust 2. It breaks the sound barrier. And the guy sits there and goes, what the hell do I do now?
Yeah, there is this very funny moment where the night before the winning team enter Paris, they're sort of at Meux, so very, very close to the finish line. There's no way they can't make it, even if they have to push the car themselves and not even switch it on, they would still make it to Paris. So, it's a done deal. And they're sort of thinking about the miles they've travelled so far. They sort of cast their mind back and think about, these huge flagstones that they drove over in Peking, and then the sand of the Gobi and the mud of the Urals, and they sort of cast their mind back over the miles that they've travelled. And yes, the feeling is one of anticlimax in a way. They've done what they set out to do. It's come to an end. And there's a sadness there, as well as that feeling of triumph, which is so human. And I think, who hasn't felt like that when you've set your mind to do something and had this idea, for so long, and then suddenly you get to the moment when you're about to accomplish it, and you almost sort of want to, to pump the brakes, because you don't want that feeling, you don't want that dream to be realised, because then it's no longer a dream, it's a reality. And I think that's the very human emotion that they experience. And again, it just felt so relatable.
And personally, you must have had pretty much the same feeling, because you've spent years researching a book. You've written it. It's gone off. Was there a moment for you that was anticlimactic at that point? Did you think, I've finished it, what now?
Well, there is a very weird stage in book publishing when you've handed the manuscript in, it's been approved, you've done all the kind of corrections that you can do, but the book hasn't yet been printed. So there's nothing you can do, but you can't yet celebrate it because you don't yet have a physical object. You can't yet be like Scrooge McDuck, holding all your copies, being like, or giving them to people and saying, thank you for the help, or whatever. You don't yet have a thing, and there's nothing you can do to affect the work you've done. You're just waiting, and that is very much that feeling of anticlimax. But this was a very strange book to write, because it was a book about this massive expansive journey, this moment of explosion and renewal and optimism and new technology, and yet the majority of the writing was done during COVID. So I was sat at home, at my desk. At one period you were only allowed out, as everyone will remember, you were only allowed out for an hour. So I never have I felt more cooped up while writing a story about a moment when suddenly the world opens up in this very extreme way. So that was a real mismatch. And also, I had hoped to do the journey myself with my husband, and we actually bought a Toyota Land Cruiser, and we took delivery in January 2020. And of course, we had 2 years of COVID, and then war between Russia and Ukraine, and I also was pregnant and then gave birth while writing this book. So I was writing the week that I gave birth, and then returned to the book when my daughter was 6 weeks old. And so it's been sort of very it's been a very strange writing journey for me personally, and I hope that doesn't come across in the book.
No, I think what happened with you is you took inspiration from your own book, didn't you? It inspired you to want to do something. Absolutely. Which then got kiboshed by all these external sources. Are you still planning to do the journey?
I'd love to do it. I mean, obviously now we'd be doing it with an 18-month-old in tow, and as I said, she's very badly car sick on even a 10-minute journey. So I dread to think how we'd all feel after reaching Paris. Maybe it would cure her, and maybe we'd just never want to get in a car again. I don't know. But I'd love to do it. I'd really love to do it. The problem at the moment is obviously doing the original route, or choosing one competitor's route to follow, would take you all the way through Russia, which doesn't feel something like I particularly want to take on, perhaps at the moment with the political tensions. Although I have been learning Russian for coming on for 3 or 4 years now. So maybe by the time that I'm able to do it and grab the courage to drive all the way through Russia, my Russian will be, well, if not flawless, a lot better than it is now, and I'll be able to say, help, I can't use a spanner, or help, my daughter's vomited in the back of our car, or whatever the emergency of the day is.